So the Plum Village collaboration is a bit sort of, I guess it's a good place to start out to give you an idea of where I come from, science and Sangha, and science and contemplation from. Of course, Plum Village is a monastery in the south of France. It's the largest monastery in the Western world. It's Thich Nhat Hanh's monastery, 300 monks and nuns, and which is a Vietnamese Zen tradition, and of engaged Buddhism. There's a feeling of need of engagement because science is part of the reception of Buddhism, spiritual exploration, what have you, in the Western world, and will be more so in the future. It's sort of whether we like it or not. That sort of older Vietnamese monks and nuns, for example, might not really want to be part of science or to have a conversation about it because they don't think it's particularly relevant. And some other younger people might say, well, but we kind of have to. A way of thinking about it might even be that it's the reincarnation of contemporary environment. So many people would say that the Buddha talked in terms of the language of reincarnation in order to communicate the Dharma. However, the culture of the West in the contemporary time has science woven into it. And so you have to sort of speak the language of science in order to communicate to large swaths of the population, at least, who really buy into science, right, or see the world from a scientific viewpoint. There are, of course, other people who don't like science and find it sort of intrusive. And that's, I don't have any judgment really on either side. I'm, of course, practice with Plum Village, so I try to be non-attached to views. That's number one in our mindfulness trainings. And it's something that's very important in science as well, to be able to give up ideas and have a conversation. So that's sort of where I come, to phrase the approach to sort of science and contemplation that I've been part of. Okay, and a little bit more of the organization that I'm part of, Art Earth Tech, is a bit creating the conditions for a wiser world. And that means that essentially the Western world is out of touch, I'd say, with what we call mystery, the mystical, the ability to see things in some form. I don't actually know if Triratna's used this word, but the ultimate dimension, the sort of...
Talk about the transcendental.
The transcendental dimension. Yeah, exactly. The transcendental dimension in the Triratna's preferred language, we'd call it the ultimate versus the historical, the relative dimension. So there's here, right, that we are non-conceptually before we have conceptual kind of intervention, and then when you start breaking things up, the tendon to left and right, up and down, then you're in another place. And sort of the ability to get in touch with that ultimate dimension or transcendental dimension is necessary for new approaches, and we need new approaches dramatically. And we need a conversation quickly between people who can access that kind of awareness from which new approaches come to achieve social change. So really the idea is to create spaces for that type of conversation to take place, because it can't take place in the types of spaces where that we habitually kind of inhabit or have created in this culture. Now, some of you might have heard a phrase that Thich Nhat Hanh uttered once, which is, the next enlightened being might be a Sangha, by which he means that the Western world is so anathema to the sort of awakening, the way of awakening, right? Which is another just direct translation of Buddhism, that it just can't, an individual can't go off into a forest and become awakened. So sort of a community where people can be around other people who are trying as well to be in touch with the truth is the more productive route. And so we're endeavoring to sort of create spaces for those kinds of conversations, and then a conversation about how would you change society so that society as a whole is more in touch with that, so that we can, we can evolve before we go extinct. Basically, to hit on a festival theme. Okay. So, yeah, we can call Buddhism an ancient route of inquiry, right? But there is a sort of, it's a different kind of disciplined viewing of to get to the sort of point of the talk, science and Sangha, right? Sangha, of course, I think most people here know Sangha is a community of practice, right? A community where people together sort of try to see more clearly, right? Like it's not necessarily about intellectual belief. That's helpful, but really about convictions as well. Like everybody in this room thinks that everything's impermanent. Nobody's, totally convinced that everything's impermanent, probably. And empty, everybody's probably also aware of the idea that everything is absent of self-nature, right? So that's called emptiness. That there's nothing that's made of elements that are of itself, but they're all made of constituent elements, so that things fall apart. And if you realize that at the deepest possible level, then you don't get attached to anything. But if you just believe it intellectually, then you get attached to all sorts of things, right? So it's about building conviction together. And so how do we do that as a Sangha, right? And what does science have to say about it? Okay. And you can say that Buddhism, as much as anything, is a way of coming to conviction together, and that comes out of a kind of inquiry that comes into inward looking, inward observation, deep observation, which is in a way different than science. Okay, and so it's something of an uncomfortable subject for some people, because kind of the scientific conversation is not very humble, right? First, to get to the first point of the talk. If you take Buddhism as a legitimate form of inquiry with its own practices and its own methods of looking directly at consciousness and saying, what do I see? That might just be valid, then mindfulness meditation should be a great achievement. And the fact that so many people are doing it to such great effect should be a great achievement, because it didn't, according to Buddhists, they wouldn't say that this happened by accident, right? It happened because there was thousands of years of this kind of inquiry in India, and before even mindfulness started out, right? Gautama himself was the finest flower of a tradition that came before, him. Right, we all wonder why were there so many great bands in the 60s. Because the conditions were correct, right? And Gautama probably lived in the 60s of, beyond the 60s of spiritual inquiry, right? And so there was the art of this inward looking was being perfected at that time. He himself was part of a Sangha, right? Spiritual friends. And so then that's why we get this depth of tradition out of that particular event of his awakening. And so this is a very important question. How do we do Sangha better? Okay. And so despite that, though, there's I'll make a small criticism of science as well, is that we say we're not attached to theories in science, but there's also famous quotes that say science advances one funeral at a time, right? Which means that people generally tend to defend their theory to the death and or somebody, actually. I mean, for example, if you actually ask a bunch of scientists, how many people do you know who gave up their own theory and converted to somebody else's theory in their lifetime due to evidence? Usually people can think of like, I know this guy or that guy, one or two people but everybody holds a theory, and every single person, there's probably 6 other theories that are conflicting with their theory, and only one of them is right. So, the vast majority of scientists believe in something there's probably already a better theory around. So that means that people are probably saying 2 people out of hundreds that they know who probably should be convinced of that their ideas aren't, or thousands who are not correct. So there's a lot of attachment there, and so there's this question of building real non-attachment, which I think Buddhism can contribute to science, and that kind of non-attachment would be very useful for the really most challenging thing that Buddhism could ask science is, can you simply be in the business of helping us build better rafts to get to the other shore? Because we say that science builds rafts, in Buddha, the Dhamma, especially the intellectual components, according to the Buddha, they were a raft across the other shore, right? That we want to sort of have a non-conceptual understanding of life, and the intellectual elements of the Dhamma are simply a means of helping us get there. And that's a difficult question to ask. That basically, are you willing to be in not in the business of getting us all the way there? Because essentially, theories, right, which is what science is capable of producing, are relative truths, right? So those are, there is no ultimate truth that can be talked about. It is actually a business of language. It's something that is done in language by humans with their language capacity, which carves up ultimate reality into relative statements. And the only statements that it will ever produce are relative statements. And so therefore it can never particularly hold the ultimate truth, according to Buddhist metaphysics, which takes a lot of humility, right, to a non-attachment to move away from, which is one of many reasons why I think we need a strong. It's a mistake to simply engage with science and hope that it figures it out. That the Buddhist tradition needs to sort of stand strong and kind of defend itself. I mean, maybe we're wrong, and that's fine, and maybe we'll be asked sometimes to get rid of attachments. We might in many cases. The elementary particles of kalapas. I don't know does anybody know what a kalapa is? There's a certain original schools thought when you go deeper and deeper in meditation to single points of sensation. Those were the original Sangha thought that perhaps they were viewing the elementary particles of the universe directly. Right, so if you do like a meditation, like a Goenka meditation, it's the first time I did this. They have you go down and down and down and down to ever smaller parts of your lip, and you get to something that at some point seems like a blinking point of sensation. Now we'd say that's probably a neuron, right? But originally the idea was that was a elementary particle. Those were actually these elementary particles of sensation, out of which arose the forms, right? These forms that would always fall away. So there's an example of where actually science forced some Buddhist schools to be humble. There are others. Reincarnation, I think, will go around forever. I would say, Thich Nhat Hanh is doesn't believe in it. The Dalai Lama does. I don't want to have a debate about it, particularly because we'll never get to the end. Okay. And then there's also this question of direct experience, right? So the difficulty and the reason why we have these retreats at Plum Village especially is that how do you explain the redness of red to a colorblind person is a difficult question in cognitive science. Answer is that you can't, right? And this is why computers will never be completely intelligent as they are now, because they don't have experience. They have a language of symbols, but those symbols are always about something, right? So our symbols, our words are about something, but we have the something on which to what we call ground the symbols. Whereas the sort of scientists who, you could say it like this, if you do not spend much time in mindfulness, it's very difficult to say what mindfulness even is. Mindfulness in the original, many of the original writings would actually be described as what we would call in science a qualia. Thich Nhat Hanh would call it energy, as would many people here, which would piss off people in science. But it's also worth noting that Aristotle's concept of energia was actually quite a lot closer to what people in the sort of New Age and community would. Energia was a motive force which produced a conscious sensation, which the physical concept is an analogy for that concept, which now has taken over the use of the word, such that it means what physicists mean when they talk about energy. But originally it was about qualia in Aristotle's time. But we can't explain qualia. So if you don't have direct experience of what does it feel like to be mindful, how do you really talk about mindfulness in concepts? You have to be able to ground it. Again, so no direct experience, no real ability to talk about it conceptually, or really to understand people who are talking about. So when the tradition says we feel this, then how do you then explain that to scientists? Very difficult, right? So there's a lot of humility both about whether your personal experiences of what the mind is like or could be like reflect what actually a mind could be like. Right? I mean, that is another very core contention of all of Buddhist schools, is that we are stuck by habit in a very particular address of the possibilities of all possibilities for human consciousness, and it takes a Sangha to get out, right, and a practice. It takes the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha all to get out. Okay. So, and then further sort of point for humility is just this idea of an art versus a science. That an art is something that you have to look outward and apply knowledge all the time. There's constant adjustment required. Engineering and architecture, have rules, but they're more like arts, right? You actually people engineer something, and then that something is reproduced many, many times, that exact thing, but every time they want to do something new or differently or with different materials or more cheaply, then there's a new problem to solve, new principles to apply in a different way. And so you need science in order to do engineering, but engineering itself is quite an art, similar like architecture. And in general, I'm going to contend that Sangha building is going to be an art, as is communication of stillness, as is communication of mindfulness, emptiness, and the rest. Those essentially are arts, not really sciences. You can't probably reduce them to rules. Like we don't think we're going to reduce engineering to an actual science. Like there's going to be a book that says whatever problem you want to solve, you could just look up, apply this formula, and here's the machine, right? That would just blow the mind of an engineer to even suggest that. So whatever mind you have and what experiences you have, this is the way out of that mind and into freedom. Should be possible because by some scientific advances You know, good question. You know, why would we believe that? Probably because we haven't, you know, tried hard enough so that slamming our head against the wall yet as a scientific community to get to that point. But, you know, it on its face, I don't think it's very reasonable to expect that. Okay. And I mean, another way of saying a technique in art, right? A technique is something that works kind of when there's something to grasp. Because a technique is really something that is, you can apply over and over and over again. Like painters have techniques, right? Doesn't make painting not an art. You have particular techniques as you come across the same situation over and over again and you apply it, but always differently. And so that's another thing that science can be humble about. Okay. Okay. So things that it's hard to study is consciousness generally, because, well, I mean, to put it really simply, just the fact that something is conscious is difficult, right? And I talked about this the other day, that the only thing that I know is conscious is me, really. I mean, you guys look like me and, I don't know, act a lot like me, and so I figure you're probably conscious as well. I give you the benefit of the doubt, and, you know, and I think the animals are conscious, but it's just a judgment call, actually. I mean, I think probably most people here agree. That's why most people here are probably vegetarians, but they're not going to tell us. You know, at least you guys will say, yes, I'm conscious. But none of the animals will do this. And, you know, none of the material outside in the universe will either. They're not going to report this. The only way I know that other people are sort of conscious is that they tell me so. You know, they wake up and they say, yes, I'm conscious now. And if a dog told me that I could start speaking, we taught a dog to speak and said, yes, I'm conscious, then we would probably convince everybody. But we aren't going to probably do that with the poll, or, you know, we wouldn't know, right? We wouldn't know whether it was or wasn't, or if there was anything like consciousness in there. Not that the consciousness in the human mind isn't special in some way, that it has memories, that it can form a mind, that can think about things, etc. But actually, this idea that consciousness is everywhere gets more and more respectable in the scientific community every day. Like Christoph Koch, who is the head of the Paul Allen Neuroscience Laboratory in Seattle, which is extremely well-funded. Paul Allen is a billionaire who gave a huge amount to study neuroscience, believes that basically everywhere where there's what he calls integration getting integrated, there's consciousness, right? And you know, philosophers are saying variants on that all over the place, that there's something like, and scientists, that there's consciousness kind of all around, is actually a better explanation. It's simpler because, okay, well then if it's just everywhere, then we don't have to explain why it rises particularly in humans. Maybe it's just kind of everywhere, and it's a bit particular, like it's an inherent property of the universe, and we don't have to invent new theories to explain human consciousness. And so that's something that's difficult, right? And that gets at the point that it's inward. We can't really talk about it as very special consciousness. Okay. Yeah. And so I would say, you know, for example, something like Nirvana, you know, that's even more so, okay, if someone in this room says they have Nirvana, will we believe them? Maybe, maybe not, you know, probably it depends on how well they either show the fruits of practice or fake it. But, you know, will then science believe them? No. You know, so, you know, very, you know, how, if there is something like that, will something like that be studied? You know, what you can do, and this thing is that if you could show that their brain is very, very different if there's something very particular going on in their brain, it would increase the plausibility of it, though, right? And so that's what science has been able to do, is kind of give us some ability to show that there's something special about what's going on inside the minds of meditators. So people who already started doing it, it's kind of another version of the fruits of practice, but at a neural level, right? That because we already had Deva, at some point probably people said about Deva that, oh yeah, he started doing this meditation stuff and he seems much more calm and peaceful, and he's much more, much less stressed. Which was basically most meditation studies. That's what they're doing on a controlled level, right? That people go into a meditation study. They take a course of some kind, and they take a questionnaire at the end, and they mark the questionnaire certain ways. It goes up or it goes down, and they say, okay, that person improved, but in a very scientific and rigorous way, and it's very convincing for people, and it helps people take refuge in the practice, and so I think that's very helpful. And science can do more of that. And it can also do some things like, actually, I think we could study non-attachment fairly probably. This is the thing that we could probably actually substantiate that there's something like not being attached, so that you can say a way of, you've probably heard about Skinnerian conditioning of rats, right? So that people press, you basically give a rat pellets when it presses the lever, then it presses the lever more, right? The more pellets you give after it presses the lever, the more, it will kind of press the lever, right? You can condition rats to press levers, and that's a bit like habit formation. But you can, non-attachment is a bit like, well, I don't have to respond that way. I don't have to acquire the conditioning. I can actually acquire less of a habit or an urge to press the lever if I simply don't attach to the sensation of the pellet hitting, the sensation it creates, the positive sensations that it creates when I eat it, right? So this is the overall, when you're not getting attached as a practitioner, it's sort of, you feel things coming in, but this is great, but I'm not going to get attached to this always being this way. And that would be a bit like, okay, then the automatic reactions of a meditator, the next time it's presented the lever, are not as strong, right? You could probably see that both neurally, and you can probably see it in terms of their behavior, and you can see that they're probably attached versus non-attached behavior internally matches up with what they say. I'm now, practicing non-attachment or equanimity to what I'm experiencing, and therefore fewer habits. And so that could be, that can also help a lot. Science can help that way. So there's some things like that which we can help out with as scientists. And I think grasping as a source of suffering could be understood more completely as well, in a similar way. That's a very similar idea, and so that's good, right? But there's more things to worry about than that. It's studying Sangha, right? How do we actually get people to be unattached all the time? Because we all, people who have a practice are convinced, not being attached will release me from suffering, but actually doing that is a different business, and it's best done with a bunch of sort of co-conspirators to break the overall habit of getting attached to things. And so how do you start to study that, right? That's the difficult bit, right? Sangha, okay, so. Let's see. Yeah. So in scientific studies, you can sort of make up a temporary Sangha, like an MBSR course, are studied, right? It's sort of like a temporary Sangha that you put together. And you can study that that's useful, but Sangha is not something that you can manipulate, right? Because, and this is this really unsexy element of science, that because it's just difficult to put together types of things like a real Sangha, you can't actually get people to sit around for hours, years, decades, learning from each other, becoming spiritual friends, getting to know each other with different practices. Oh, we'll give you guys this practice, and you guys this practice. We'll put you here, and you guys will be on the internet for years, and you know, in person only, etc. You know, all the different types of things you would have to do experiments. That makes the study of Sangha very difficult for science, right? So the question is more like, what kind of principles can you identify, right? And so this is the same thing. If like you can't exhaust all the possibilities, you can't study them with control groups. You know, you have to use, like in arts or design, some principles to come up with what is a better Sangha, you know, basically. And so, you know, I have some of these written down here. Let me just read them out. Okay. Grasping is socially contagious. Okay. So, for example, speech, or saying like, "Oh, I really want to go get some pizza," right? That's socially contagious. Non-grasping is also socially contagious, but grasping is probably more socially contagious, right? It's probably more easier to communicate grasping, because language itself is sort of a bit of grasping, right? It's a dualism. You're always grasping at forms, making a separation when you use language. And language is the most viral thing that we have. It travels across the world. Particularly powerful linguistic memes travel across the world. And so grasping is quite contagious. And non-grasping is also contagious if you're around it, but you require more local concentration of non-grasping people in order to have communications of non-grasping. You know, and for one example of this would be simply walking meditation, right? Walking meditation is you put a monk, in my case, Thich Nhat Hanh, when he was around still doing walking meditation, you get behind Thich Nhat Hanh and you start walking, and there's this fluid motion, that a mindful walker has, that you just start imitating it. And so it gets into you, right, to be around people who are not grasping. And so you set people up. This person's right behind the best mindful walker, behind that. Mindfulness, because you're looking at this person, you get the mindfulness here, it's more mindfulness, down the line. And so the walkers at the front kind of communicate mindfulness to everybody behind them. So it's setting up mindfulness contagion. I asked the monks, they agree. In Plum Village, that's the point. That's why Thich Nhat Hanh did it in many ways. He became exiled from Vietnam, and he said he had to either grow a new body. It was like a cell outside his body. He did grow a new body, or perish. And so he wanted to sort of get his what he had to offer into people in the most direct possible way. And so he started doing walking meditation with people every day. And that was a very direct route where people could experience, especially people that he felt in the West, because we are so caught up in conceptual knowledge that experience of mindfulness is very, arresting to us. If you grew up in a forest, you will have mindfulness all the time because beautiful things are kind of just things that are easy to be mindful of, right? But if you are in a conceptual, conceptual world all the time, then you need some mindfulness to interrupt you. Okay. Okay. Mindfulness is not able to be remembered very well, right? So, unfortunately, this is the problem. That it's mindfulness is it's not easy because mindfulness is basically freedom from the past, or an emptiness as well. Is that you're not remembering anything when you're mindful, right? So and you can't remember. You're looking directly what's there, and so it's oftentimes we notice. I think science could probably investigate this more cleanly, but there's a certain thing if when you're doing mindfulness and you get into a very deep mindfulness state, like, wow, this is amazing. But when you just remember it, it's always kind of faint. I remember that I thought that it was great, but I don't remember what it feels like, right? And so when you have vague memories of the pleasure of what an ice cream felt like, you can kind of like remember that somehow. But mindfulness tends to be especially about outward directedness and being in the present, and we tend to, like, it's hard to reproduce that sensation because by being mindful, by trying to remember mindfulness, you're being unmindful, right? And so you can't then recall it to say how great it is. And so actually the value of it is difficult to appreciate. And so therefore, it's very difficult to make to act as though it's as valuable as it is, right, on a social level. And so that's the difficult thing, is how do we deal with that, right? And so I think there's some other things that I'll gonna mention just quickly, is that just love of nature comes naturally. If we could sort of put that down as well as something that's highly important, that if you're not attached, if you're aware that the love of nature comes naturally, love of others comes naturally, and that there is an ability to act from stillness, are all things that science could do more to show. The ability to act from stillness in particular, I think, is important to talk about because it's so foreign to our culture. So many people, especially if you like science, you've probably heard of Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And if you think about it, in that book, intuition is synonymous with analysis. And so thinking fast is basically intuition. And thinking slowly is analytical. But what about contemplation? There's actually there's no contemplation in the book, right? So contemplation is actually slow intuition. So foreign to our culture that it just simply isn't, in this book, which is a bestseller, a category. Like, it just isn't in there. But and there is some scientific evidence for it, but I think sort of studies of meditators could show that, right? And so then there's a question of, okay, how do we build a Sangha, right, that would then communicate these things? That's the question, right? So you need people who are contemplative and still, who are around each other for long periods of time. You need to be away from grasping. And so you also need to get those people together for long periods of time. That's going to be an art, right? And I would submit that really, if we want to make that happen, what we need to do is realize that it's incredibly difficult to talk about how valuable mindfulness is, but also all those other things, that if we can realize that there we are, as this festival theme is speaking about, sort of faced with this choice of evolving or going extinct, that basically you have to get meaning in order for people to make that kind of sacrifice, to be part of that Sangha as well. Because it is actually difficult. There's a great aspiration, but it's difficult to day-to-day feel how important mindfulness is. But if we do kind of realize that, yes, love of nature, love of others comes from spiritual practice, that we need it more than ever right now, and then create that as part of meaning, then you need basically a Sangha, I think, that really starts to inherit that, right? Take that on as, that's part of the reason why we're getting together, which is what Art or Tech really is about, right? So what we're trying to do is basically get people who are interested in creating the conversation that can look at the structure of a new society or a new culture, to get together and say, okay, not only are we interested in creating a new culture, but we're interested in sort of being good ancestors and becoming parts of communities, not just for ourselves, but for the future, so that we can sort of create this kind of expansive subculture, which, this stuff has always been there in Buddhism, but it's now the time that we actually have the real, the meaning is real, but it's never meant more to do this kind of thing, to be part of that, new artistry, right? And that's another point of Sangha building, is that because Sangha, because emptiness is like an art, we actually have no way scientifically to talk about the heights of it. We can say mindfulness is better than being unmindful, or an MBSR course makes you happy, but the limits of happiness that can be explored by a good Sangha, like what was it like to be part of Siddhartha Gautama's Sangha? Does anybody have any real idea? If you really entertain the notion that there was historically such a thing, and that mindfulness is an art, and it is there is the same recipe that you use in Pizza Hut and in the best pizzeria in Naples, right? The recipe doesn't change very much, but the experience does, right? And that, the recipe is vastly more complicated for mindfulness, and the heights of artistry that are available for cultivating emptiness, mindfulness, and awakening are much greater. That there's really no way that any of us, right, I think that can be proven logically, even scientifically, as an argument, that there's really no way any of us could appreciate how amazing it could be. And so now we have that actual, in a way, opportunity. And so I think that's the what's facing before us now is really realizing that there is an art to be cultivated, right? We can identify a few principles, but what we need to do really is get on with the art of creating more mindful communities. And that's going to be done through lots and lots of works of that and communities of practice.